Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. After doing the video about the 5 British World War II aircraft earlier in the week, I thought why not start a new series, and this series will just be one where we go over vehicles, tell their stories, and basically ask for them to come to the game. It doesn't really matter what nation, my only real criteria is that obviously I have a personal interest in it, and that it existed in its fullest form. So we're going to start off today with probably one of my favorite vehicles when it comes to World War II because of its interesting story, and also because of the fact that it didn't have a great story in real life, but in War Thunder it could easily have a great place. It's time to talk about the Covenanter. The first vehicle is one that I've wanted in game for a long time, and it's because of its interesting history. This is the A13 Mk.III, the Cruiser Mark V, known as the Covenanter. And the reason why I'm interested in this machine is because of the fact that it has some unique things about it, which also would not affect it in game, basically. Some of the problems that this machine had, basically down to its engine and its cooling system, would not mean that it would be affected in game. Instead, you would be looking at other areas. It also really does stand at an interesting point in history because it is the first vehicle that was actually named when it came to the cruiser tanks. It was named, obviously, the Covenanter, and being the first to be named, it started a tradition of the cruiser tanks then going into stuff such as MBTs later on, which would be named by the British Armed Forces, starting with C. So you've got the Covenanter, you've got the stuff such as the Cavalier, the Centaur, obviously you have stuff like the Carnarvon, the Churchill even, if you want to throw that in, and even to the modern day where you have the Challenger series of vehicles. The Covenanter was the start of that naming scheme, and generally I think that's why it should be put into the game. It was born out of an idea that started in 1938, where the War Office issued a requirement for a new cruiser tank. What it needed to be was a lighter and cheaper version of the Mark III that was in production at the time. And in 1939, a bunch of requirements were put out there, and also drawing boards were used to create a vehicle which would have the Christie suspension, a lower hull, and also the 2-pounder gun, which you will find on many British tanks of the time, and also a machine gun with a epicyclic steering transmission. Now, this thing didn't have heavy armor, but it was good enough for the time against the guns that it would have been facing, and one of the companies which came up to design and build this thing was London, Midland and Scottish Railway Company. Now, one of the things that this also represents is a great opportunity to talk about how the British system worked in World War II, because of the way that pretty much everything was set up in Britain. But there were a bunch of companies which built stuff which weren't exactly normally military, but because of the advent of the war, they changed into military production. So you had a bunch of businesses which would kind of build stuff which wasn't really in their remit and put ideas forward, and you would end up with really wonky ideas, but also at the same time, it's because there wasn't really any other things going on. I would actually really recommend reading the book Tank Men, because of the fact that you'll see how kind of unprepared the British were when it came to the start of the war, not just in the form of its tank doctrine, but also in the form of its production itself. When you have a look at when the tank corps were formed and when everything actually came together, it is kind of amazing that at least by 1940, everything was able to actually still function properly. And what is interesting is this company, London, Midland and Scottish Railway Company, had no experience designing tanks. They actually had no idea about, the thoughts that were going in. So they associated themselves with two other companies. You had Nuffield, which would help with the turret, and then Meadows, which would make the engine. And Meadows made a ton of engines at the time. Now, on the 17th of April 1939, 100 of these were ordered straight from the drawing board. So the War Office really liked the idea, even though obviously there were issues when it came to its design. Another thing that may also be noted is, since this is early war, we're talking 1939 at this point, many people are worried about, the prospect of war coming at that time. And, well, I suppose this is technically pre-war, but you've got to understand that everybody was ramping up and were worried. So, as what the French were doing at the time, where they ordered massive numbers of vehicles and many didn't get produced, in Britain it was a slightly different story, where a decent number of vehicles were actually ordered, but a ton of them were produced. So when it came to the Mk.III design of the A13, which is this, remember, when it comes to the naming scheme of British tanks, it's a little bit confusing. As I said, this is the A13 Mk.III, but it is also the Cruiser Mk.V, and it is known as the Covenanter. So the design itself, they chose a welded hull to save weight on it, which was an improvement over previous designs, and the armor was actually sloped on the front and rear decks, and also quite low, meaning that the silhouette was lower than you saw before, and also angled, which is something we would find in later years would be incredibly useful for ricocheting shells off of. Also, at the same time, the central superstructure barely emerged over the lower hull, covered by the mudguards, which had a characteristic shape higher than the middle of the machine. And outside the Nuffield turret, well sloped but still riveted, the Meadows engine received a Wilson transmission and the steering of the A16. The Meadows was a horizontally opposed 12-cylinder petrol engine, which was flat, wide, and this actually left no room for the radiators. So the engine took up the whole of the back of the machine, basically. It was a massive engine, which they wanted to produce 300 horsepower. That was the requirement that they went for this vehicle. Now, this engine, the DAV Flat 12, actually produced 340 horsepower, which means this thing could move around at 18 horsepower per ton, which is pretty good. But at the same time, it's a vehicle which, because the engine is so big, where are you going to put the radiators? Where are you going to put all the cooling system? What's going to go on here, right? Like, how are you going to be able to deal with this? And so after putting it in the back, they decided to relocate the radiators elsewhere on the vehicle. They actually put them on the front, and if you look at pictures of the Covenanter, you can see them as you're looking towards it on the right-hand side of the vehicle. And this is a bit of a problem, because that means that you need extra piping, which has to go past the crew, through the crew compartments, to be able to keep the engine cool. And guess what? Those pipes are pretty warm, meaning that there's a lot of uncomfortable scenarios for the crew inside, and also because at the time, obviously, we don't know if the British knew this or not, but eventually they had to fight in North Africa, and, well, let's just say that kind of design wouldn't do too well. And this unusual feature with the radiators on the front was because of the rush design, and it basically meant that the career of the Covenanter was very much cut short. And within the production run, corrections were made to improve the engine cooling, but didn't really do anything. The standard design still fit with the vehicle. The first prototypes of the vehicle were tested at the same time the production was running, since this thing was ordered off the drawing board, and it was hoped to apply modifications as they were built. The prototype models passed all tests successfully in early 1940, but delivery started only in May of 1940. And during early production, the LSMR, which was the company behind it, emitted doubt about the strength of the two-layered welded armored plates, and the construction of a reverted to a riveted design while keeping this two-layered arrangement. And for the wheels, aluminium was at first envisioned, but due to the war priorities for the aircraft industry, this was reverted back to steel, so added extra weight, and an army requirement asked for the frontal increase of armor to 40 millimeters. These raised the overall weight and suspension overload, leaving no room for further improvements for the machine. And the transmission was also reverted to the A13 crash gearbox, which was epicyclic, with its epicyclic steering units. The production was also assumed by English Electric and Leyland Motors and reached 1,771 tanks by the end of 1941. So they nearly produced 2,000 of this vehicle in approximately 2 years. Just to give you an idea, there was 4 variants of this, and just remember, keep that figure in your head, 2,000 vehicles. Now, there were 4 variants, obviously going from the Mark I all the way to the Mark IV. They differed slightly in little ways, such as the Mark II from the Mark I. The Mark II differed by a radiator-mounted oil cooler and revised metal road wheels, and a close support Mark II CS was derived, but didn't really get used. And then there was also a Mark I CS version, which would have a 3-inch howitzer to fire smoke rounds, and also a few HE rounds in store as well. And the Mark III, which was the late production Covenanter, this was from 41 to 42, this model had twin oil coolers installed around the engine, and the clutch linkage modified, and air cleaners installed at the rear, and the exhaust silencers were also moved to the ends of the track guards, with a close support Mark III CS was also derived on the vehicle. And then you have the Mark IV, these were just Mark IIs, which had an upgraded clutch arrangement of the Mark III, and that was pretty much it. And then you had also a bridge layer version. Now, as I said, just remember, nearly 2,000 of these were made. So why is it that not many people have heard of this vehicle when so many was made, when it fit the requirements, and also has all of the things that you would want from a British tank at the time? It has the 2-pounder, has pretty decent mobility, has also good armor when it's sloped, also extra armor from the radiator. But what was the problem with the vehicle? Well, since the radiator was on the front, since you had all of the extra piping, and since you had the huge engine in the back, the engine had a tendency to overheat, and also the fighting compartment ventilation was a problem, so it would actually suffocate its crew. The Covenanter was never sent abroad because of this, where other models were first-blooded in the North African campaign, because it couldn't fit the climate of North Africa. It was simple as that. Instead, all the production vehicles were used exclusively for training in the British Isles. It was given to the reconstructed British 1st Armour Division after the Dunkirk evacuation, and then they were transferred to the 9th Armoured Division when the 1st was transferred to North Africa, and a small batch of Covenanters actually saw the light of Africa with an REME, with the Royal Electric and Mechanical Engineers for maintenance and evaluation, and according to photos, possibly saw action with the King's Forces Churchill's Mark IIIs. There was also some Covenanters which equipped the Guards Armoured Division and part of the 1st Polish Armoured Division for training once again, and the only time it seems a Covenanter saw action is when it was bombed near Canterbury, as it was stationed during an air raid by the Luftwaffe in May of 1942. And by 1943, the poor protection and armament led to the General Staff to declare the model obsolete. By that point, by 1941, it was obsolete. But yeah, kind of as simple as that. Some of the Covenanters then, as we said, converted to bridge layers, and they actually were used in Belgium and the Netherlands in 1943. So this vehicle is one of a sad story. An interesting design, an innovative design when it was actually procured in 1939. But because of production issues, because of engine issues, and also because of mainly cooling issues, it missed the Battle of France. It was ready by the end of the Battle of France, and then the armor pretty much became obsolete. With the 2-pounder, in stuff like the Battle of France and also Belgium and all of those areas, it was actually able to outrange a lot of the panzers which were around at the time. It had a short 50mm, it had access to a short 70. The Germans had access, obviously, to the short 75 in very limited capacity, and also many Panzer Is and Panzer IIs, which the Covenanter could actually stand up against. And because of this, it would have actually been really good in the Battle of France. But it came around too late. And once North Africa rolled around, the Germans had actually created the long-barreled 50. And by that point on the Panzer IIIs, this pretty much meant that the Covenanter would be outranged by the Panzer IIIs, not just because of the additional armor on the later variants of the Panzer III, but also the longer 50, and also it had the engine issues and the radiator issues. So overall, nearly 2,000 of these things were built, and it didn't go anywhere. It's a very sad story, but the thing is about these vehicles, it would be lovely to see them in War Thunder because of the fact that the issues that it had in real life wouldn't affect it when it comes to the game. And at the same time, you could have a bunch of variants, not just with the 2-pounder, but also with the close infantry support gun as well. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Professor X 1718, Orange Tail, Sakoshi Tiger, BRFC 15, Teddy, John Ryman, Universe A, Eugens Terry, Ambrosius McClellan, Daniel Stanton, Martinez, B. Young, and then Kyle Kin, Barine, Lafouche, and also Samuel Slick for supporting the channel.